Good morning, my fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. It is indeed a wonderful privilege to be with you one more time to discuss a very important topical matter. Now, I hope that you're doing very well today, and let's get into the weeds of our discussion. Now, today we will be looking at Michael Manley's, briefly rather, at Michael Manley's second term in office. Now, Michael Manley, for those of you who do not know, was a Jamaican politician who was perhaps one of the most charismatic political leaders since independent Jamaica, that is, since 1962. Now, Michael Manley came to office in 1969 up on the demission of office of his former of his father, Michael Norman Washington Manley. That was in 1969. So Michael Manley came to office after Norman Manley rather, demitted office in 1969. And he ascended to the office of the Prime Minister in 1972 when he won that general election in 1972 and became the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Now, Michael Manley is noted in the 1970s as a revolutionary, right? He was a democratic socialist, as he branded himself, right? He believed in the tenets of democracy, but he also thought that, for democracy to function, particularly in the global South, you need some social, what should I say now, improvements in the lives of the people. Because as we often say, that a lot of times we balance the budget, but we do not balance the lives of the people. We often talk about economic growth, but we do not talk about growth and development of our people. And when I talk about growth, I mean growth in the educational sector, in healthcare, right? Just about all facets of human lives, right? But the fact of the matter is that Michael Manley was one who was ahead of his time in terms of he wanted to see the countries in the global south moving rapidly towards development. And at that time, in the era of the Cold War, he perhaps wanted to seize that opportunity, whilst, the United States was competing with the Soviet Union in terms of who would ultimately be the superpower of the world. So if we could have developed in that time, right, then he thought that that would be the best idea. I'm not sure if Michael Manley foresaw that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse and that we would be left with the United States. I'm not sure what he was thinking, but certainly he was in a hurry, right, to ensure that Jamaica's development, right, was one that we could be proud of, right, during his tenure, during his two terms in office during the 1970s. Now, the 1970s were very, very, very turbulent, right? Because particularly after Michael Mann decided to support Cuba in their quest to send soldiers to Angola in their revolutionary war for independence, right? Michael Manley, supported Cuba's effort because Michael Manley believed in independence, right? And he believed in freedom. And he thought that, each country should have its own self-determination and they should also have a great amount of autonomy in terms of how decisions are made, right? And that goal at the time was still linked to Portugal, right? So he wanted to free that particular country, and he supported Cuban forces in Angola in 1975 against the desires and wishes of the United States. Now, when the United States saw that, they decided that they were going to get rid of Michael Manley in, in whatever way that they could, right? So that's when we had the ramping up of the CIA presence in Jamaica and their destabilization efforts, right? Because that's what they do. The CIA and the FBI, whatever they are, these secret organizations or these intelligence services are not just there to gather intelligence, as some of you would like to believe, right? But they actually are behind a lot of the coups, right? That we have seen in Latin America and the Caribbean and the wider world, right? And it's time for us to understand that because a lot of times when we see these intelligence agencies, rather, people tend to believe based on the propaganda proliferated by the mainstream media that these people are there to free, right, the citizens and to ensure that they have democracy, right, in America's quest to spread democracy. But that is the entire opposite. And it's time for you to do your reading, time for you to do your research and begin to grasp and begin to understand what is happening in the world. When America says that it's there to spread democracy, it's there for full spectrum dominance, right? That's what it's there to do. And when we talk about full spectrum dominance, we're talking about in all spheres, in economic, in politics, in the military reform, right? So we need to understand that. Now, Jamaica is strategically located, so the United States is interested in Jamaica, not because Jamaica has any resources, right? Like they have any minerals, or at the time we had bauxite in the 1970s, 60s. But at this time, we have no natural resources that the United States would be yearning for. However, in that time, of course, Michael, we were the second producer of bauxite, right? For those of you who are not aware of Jamaica's history. Now, Michael Manley, when he came to power, he was opposing this sort of American imperialism on the island, right? Because most of our industries were controlled by Americans or Canadians. And he wanted them to understand that they cannot just come to Jamaica, invest in Jamaica, and expatriate their wealth to back to America or to Canada, all right, or to whatever tax havens that they deem fit for them to have expatriated their profits. Now, the fact of the matter is that Michael Manley imposed, right, tax levies on these people, on these investors, right, on these foreign investors, so-called foreign investors, that is, right, because they were really extracting our wealth. So we probably should call them foreign parasites, right, because that's what they are, right? They are really parasites where they come to your economy and they suck the economic lifeblood from the country, right? People believe that because they're giving a few jobs, but the jobs are so they come with measly salaries, right? They're not necessarily well-paid jobs, right? That most of them give. You know, for the upper echelons of society, perhaps you would have jobs, one or two jobs, but for the most part, these jobs are not well secured jobs, and they're jobs that are not permanent and will help the country to grow and to develop in the way that it ought to, right? So Michael Manley imposed more taxes on them so that they could aid in the process of Jamaica's development. These people, these foreign investors from Canada and from the United States were very, very much irate, right? And they decided, for example, to move their industries like the bauxite company to Brazil and other countries in which they would not have to be under that sort of tax obligations, right? So Michael Manley was a very progressive president, right? Or prime minister, I should say. We have a parliamentary democracy, so he was a progressive prime minister, charismatic, also one of the finest orators that the Caribbean has ever seen. Now, it is interesting that Michael Manley, during his second term, became now a capitalist, right? He became a free marketer, advocate, believing that capitalism is what was going to give Jamaica its development. Well, I'm not sure if he believed in that or it is because he understood by the time he came back to office. And for those of you who do not know, Michael Manley, as I've said before, came to power in Jamaica as prime minister in 1972, and then he served for 2 terms in which he demitted office in 1980. Because in 1980 was when Jamaica was at the height of its political violence, right? Crime and violence and political destabilization efforts. And the government, Mr. Siaga's government, that is Mr. Edward Siaga, who was a capitalist and he was also a pro-US candidate, right? Now, many people believe that Mr. Siaga also worked for the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, that's the CIA. I mean, I don't know, right? But the fact of the matter is lots of things that were happening on the island proved to some extent that he was, right? Anyway, Mr. Siaga came to office in 1980, and he also spent 2 terms, right? From 1980 to 1989. when we had our general elections and Mr. Sepa was deposed as Prime Minister of Jamaica, and Michael Manley again once more became Prime Minister of Jamaica. That tenure of Michael Manley, the 1989 that he got in 1989, was reduced to just about 2 years, right? It was short-lived. He eventually developed prostate cancer and was not able to finish his tenure. And then we had Mr. P.J. Patterson, who came to power in 1992 to replace Michael Manley. Now, Michael Manley, during those 2 or 3 years, as I just mentioned, became an indefatigable advocate of capitalism. And, I just wanted to show you here something that was written by the Economist newspaper and about our Michael Manley and that sort of conversion, his conversion to capitalism. Right? So let's go here. It says here, The Economist, and this was written on March 13th, 1997. Now, Michael Manley died in 1997, right? So obviously the author is writing his obituary, and he's reflecting on Michael Manley's tenure as Prime Minister of Jamaica. Now, the Michael Manley who visited the United States in 1990 had cast aside his Che Guevara bush jacket in favor of a suit. The free market had replaced his party's 10 steps to socialism. President Bush was happy to bless a sinner who had apparently repented, and he went out of his way to praise the first-class job that Mr. Manley was doing as Prime Minister of Jamaica. It takes style and gall to change sides successfully, and Mr. Manley had plenty of both. He turned on a reporter who seemed puzzled that the old lefty had become a free marketeer and said, "Is your outlook on everything the same as it was 10 years ago?" Right? So Mr. Manley was asking the journalist, because the journalist was actually surprised that he had made this sort of conversion to capitalism, because before, the entire world, particularly those in the global south, knew Michael Manley as a lefty, right? As a revolutionary person, as a Marxist, as a socialist, right? And in Jamaica, we knew him as a democratic socialist, even though people on the right called him a communist who was greatly aligned with Fidel Castro, right? Now, the conversion of Michael Manley meant more to the Americans than the simple falling into line of a politician from a small neighboring island. Mr. Manley sought to be an international figure, right? And he was an international figure. Even I think he probably perhaps was more of an international figure in the 1970s. I do not think any other Jamaican politician, to my knowledge, has that sort of international global appeal like that of Michael Manley, right? Perhaps we could say Marcus Garvey, but Marcus Garvey was not an elected official, right? He actually went back to Jamaica after he was deported from the United States in the 1930s, right? And he formed the PPP, right? That was at the People's Party. I can't remember the entire name of that acronym, the PPP's party. But Marcus Garvey was not elected, was not an elected official, and he also did not preside over independent Jamaica. But Michael Manley did, all right? He was both an elected official and he presided over independent Jamaica, right? So I think that from that perspective, Michael Manley is still the most popular Jamaican politician that independent Jamaica has seen. Now, one of the things about Michael Manley, and let's go back to another article that was written by this newspaper. I think it's Open Democracy. I am not sure if it's a newspaper or it's a magazine. It could be both, right? Or it could be either or. You can't understand Thatcherism without knowing about Michael Manley. And we know about Margaret Thatcher and what's his name, that Reagan and right. So both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were conservatists. They believed in conservatism, right? And they were right-wing people, right? And they believed in the free market capitalist ideology. right? And for those of you who don't understand what the free market is all about, they're just telling you that, market is the operating ideology that the market knows best, right? It's not the government that looks and see how they can improve the lives of the citizens, but the market is like a god, right? It's like a religion, and they go with whatever the market indicators suggest, right? It has nothing to do with a pragmatic approach, right? But for example, the dollar, whatever is happening in that particular day, if you liberalize your economy, if you open up your economy, then your dollar can be devalued, right? And it has nothing to do whether you are producing or not in some cases. It's just the way how the market runs, right? And that is how it is all about. Now, for those of you who study slavery, it has some, parallels to what happened during the transatlantic slave trade. And in other words, in the economic realm, it is the survival of the fittest, right? Whoever is stronger, right? That is the person that will survive. So free market does not mean free in any way, right? It means that the market is controlled by dominant economic forces, right? So for example, the United States controls to a great extent the economies of the world, right? Through its international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and also the World Bank, right? And lots of other institutions also, right? And if it cannot control you through the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, they'll control your economy through the military, right? Through their military might. Then you understand who is in charge and who runs the show, right? So you don't think that Dr. What's his name down there in Jamaica, that the doctor, um, I don't know why I forgot his name right now. Yeah, the finance minister, right? Do not think that he is the one who controls the operations of what's going on in Jamaica. Dr. Nigel Clark, right? Dr. Nigel Clark is not controlling, does not control anything in Jamaica or what's going on in the economic realm. He's just following what the market indicators tell him to do, right? And he perhaps looks at different computer models, right? And then he tells you these in fancy terms, and you believe that he's speaking coherently, right? When all he's talking is nonsense, right? But people believe him because he's a graduate of Oxford University and he's a Rhodes Scholar. So therefore, he's there to improve Jamaica's economy, and he knows the math and he knows about economics and stuff like that. But you'd be surprised that many of these people are indoctrinated into this market or free market ideology that they can't even think for themselves, right? And that is what we have to understand. That's how strong propaganda and the whole system of indoctrination is. Now, today, when we think of Thatcherism, as the article here is suggesting, and the birth of neoliberalism, the new economic order Margaret Thatcher helped install, we think of striking miners, yuppies, and riots from Brixton to Toxteth. But Thatcher's vision for change stretched beyond a domestic project. Too often we think of Thatcherism separately from the global context in which it arose. There is a prehistory to Thatcherism and the wider ideology of neoliberalism, one that takes place in the aftermath of decolonization in what was called the British West Indies. With conversations about decolonization, or decolonizing rather, our institutions becoming more prominent, it's important to remember that Thatcherism simply would not have triumphed in the UK without the defeat of another political vision then emerging from what was once among Britain's most lucrative colonies, Jamaica. So it seems therefore that Michael Manley, among others like Chile, right? Chile's Allende and these social democrats, right, were the ones who would have caused this sort of Thatcherism and Reaganism to have surfaced around the world, including Reaganism in the United States and Thatcherism in London, in Britain, right? Now, in Britain, the countries we assume have histories that are tightly bound with our own, usually include the likes of the USA, Germany, or France. But prior to independence, the island of Jamaica had been under British control for nearly 300 years. The Kingdom of England gained the island of Jamaica as part of the 1670 Treaty of Madrid, over 3 decades before the Act of Union would create the modern British state, making Jamaica part of Britain from its very inception. And, he goes on to speak about, Michael Manley's democratic socialism. Right. Now, the scion of a famous political dynasty, Michael Manley, could have easily become just a kind of establishment figure that could be trusted to take charge of a vital former colony without rocking the boat. Educated at exclusive British colonial schools, Manley served as a fighter pilot in the Second World War. But after the war, Manley took up his university studies at the London School of Economics, where the teachings of Marxist professors like Harold Lasky, right, and Ralph Miliband made an impression on him. He moved from theory to practice when he returned to Jamaica to inherit the leadership of the People's National Party from his father, Norman Manley, becoming Prime Minister 50 years ago in 1972. Right? So Michael Manley went to elite institutions. Even in Jamaica, he went to Jamaica College, a very prestigious all-boys institution in Kingston. Now, upon taking office, he began implementing one of the most ambitious programs of social reform that has ever been tried in a former British colony. But it was on the international scene or stage that Michael Manley would cause the greatest stir. For him, the arena of international law offered the perfect avenue to organize all of the recently decolonized countries to use their growing power to call for what he and his allies would christen a new international economic order. Right? So Michael Manley was one of the premier authors of the new international economic order. Right? For those of you who do not know, Jamaica was very, very important in the 1970s in terms of foreign policy. So even though we were a small little island in the Caribbean Sea, yet still we've had, particularly during the time of Michael Manley, we played a very gigantic role, right, in foreign relations, right, in foreign diplomatic circles, and in terms of effectuating change, right, social and economic change in the world, right, we were at the front and center of that change that we wanted to see, particularly in the global south. Now, after the failure of free marketers like Enoch Powell and Keith Joseph to seize control of Conservative Party in 1975, Margaret Thatcher succeeded where they had failed, and after the 1979 election, became Britain's first woman prime minister. Thatcher's position was reinforced by the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan as the new US president. The Anglosphere had taken a decisive ideological turn, just in time for tensions to come to a head. In 1981, 22 heads of state from across 5 continents met for the world's first and only North-South conference. The world leaders gathered at the Cancun Sheraton, looking out over the coast of Mexico towards the crisp Caribbean Sea, an idyllic setting to contrast with the tension that underpinned the power struggles taking place. So Michael Manley was a larger than life politician, right? A guy who has, effectuated and who has advocated for freedoms and for development, particularly in the third world countries. Right? Now, we must remember that this was in light of the Cold War, because the United States was claiming that she was fighting for freedom and democracy, right? To spread freedom and democracy around the world, while, she assumed or she intimated, right, that the Soviet Union actually was trying to impose dictatorship, right? Dictatorial communism on the rest of the world, right? So the rest, it was freedom versus, if you wanted to be controlled, right? If you wanted to be a totalitarian regime or a totalitarian country, that was the sort of propaganda that was spread. And it has not changed today, right? Then we're hearing about the war on terror and the fact that it's either you want a free world or you want to be a part of a world that is enslaved. And people don't understand that it's much more nuanced than that. It's much more textured than that. And we've got to look more deeply at these actors and players. I often call them actors because that's what our politicians do. For the most part, they're actors. They're not real people. You are the ones who take them seriously, but I don't. And I'm not suggesting here that you should not do what you need to do as an intelligent citizen. But what I'm saying to you that you ought not to believe everything that your politicians tell you, right? Everything that they say, because you're going to see in most cases that what they say and how they act eventually are in total contradiction, right? Of what the whole agenda is. Now, over the following decades, Manley's dream of countries being able to exert democratic control over multinational capitalism drifted further and further away. After 9 years out of office, so this is a change now that Michael Manley is making. He would eventually be re-elected in Jamaica in 1989. But the change in global context, and I've always said to you that you must understand the historical context. Everything that is done is just not done in isolation, right? COVID did not come about in isolation, as many of you believe, right? You must understand the context of everything. If you don't, then you are going to be deceived. No matter how intelligent you think you are, how much education you think you would have or you have, all right? You must read, you must understand the context in which people say things and in which the world operates. Now, that his second stint as prime minister would look very different from his first. So the author is claiming here that his first term, his first stint as prime minister would definitely be different because in the 1970s, again, he was a social democrat, right? He believed in social democracy, right? When Michael Manley entered office, the Cold War had just finished and the end of history was being proclaimed. The radical third world leaders who had supported him in the 1970s had either given in, gone away, or had been killed. Right? For Thatcher and her supporters, perhaps the sweetest revenge was in watching Manley as he returned to office, having to embrace many of the free market reforms that he had spent so much of his first premiership opposing. When he left office, just a little over a year after Thatcher's own long stint in power had ended, Manley would say that he now shared political perspectives very, very similar to those of Margaret Thatcher. So here is a converted Michael Manley, as the Economist newspaper, the author of the Economist piece suggested, right? He was no longer Michael Manley, right? The person who advocated for democratic socialism, right? He was now a free marketeer, right? Who supported the whole system of foreign investors coming to your country, wreaking and also havoc on the economic conditions and also exploiting labor, right? While stealing the country's resources, plunging, pillaging, right? The nation's private resources. And that is what these countries do. The other day I was having a conversation with an Italian, and he was commenting on the whole matter of what he saw in third world countries. And I was sharing with him that that's how the world operates, that the elevated lifestyle that you see in North America, in the United States and in Canada and most of Western Europe, is dependent on making the third world poor, right? So you live comfortably that, and while the people in these poor countries are the ones who are maintaining at much sacrifice your comfort. So don't believe that the entire world is going to be rich or it's going to be living comfortably, because it's not going to live that sort of lifestyle if we continue in this unequal dispensing this sort of inequity that governs this whole sort of free market economic ideology. When Manley's second term as prime minister finished, it appeared as if neoliberalism was unbeatable. right? And those of us who lived through the decade of the 1990s understand that was when the Jamaican economy started to falter and will never, ever come back to the time before that era, right? It will never. So if you think that Dr. Nigel Clark and Andrew Holness will bring you that sort of time when you're going to have foreign investors coming and you have the emergence, the reemergence of local industries, right? You better think. I mean, it's not even happening in the United States, right? I mean, the United States is now not even a productive nation, right? Almost all of its industries have now been outsourced, right? And that neoliberalism ideology took place in America, particularly under Reagan and under Bill Clinton, right? Right? And some of you think that Bill Clinton was this great president, right? But I have news for you, right? Well, maybe one day we should have a sort of video on you know on Billy, right? Now, even Manley had to accept its promise of trickle-down wealth. Now, as we mark the 50th anniversary of his first election, the financial crash, Brexit, and COVID have all reinforced the impression that the wealth tap is firmly shut and the privatization that Thatcher helped to impose upon the decolonized world has led to skyrocketing inequality, not only abroad, but in Britain as well. Jamaica and the other former colonies were used as testing grounds. And I want you to understand this. You must understand this if you are going to understand the countries in which you live. Some of you know, particularly Jamaican diaspora and diaspora of other countries who live in North America and in Britain and other parts of the so-called industrialized societies believe that the lifestyle that you live there is going to continue on. But you are the ones who should be educating the natives there to let them understand that the neoliberal policies are there, have arrived, right? And the outsourcing of these industries, from North America or Britain to China and among other countries, right, is not happening coincidentally. It is happening by design, right? To impoverish the citizens. And everything is being privatized so that it goes back into the hands of the billionaires who are going to exploit you, right? And when you think about even the Obama's healthcare in 2010, right? If you read the document carefully, you're going to realize that healthcare is going into the hands of the billionaires. And if you did not see that, I'm sure that the pandemic would have, eventually unmasked that, right? So if you think this is free, and anything that they say is free, like the free market and all, anything that they use that is free, you've got to be careful. Because if it is unmasked, you will realize, and when I say if it is, I mean if the ideology behind that free system is unmasked, you will see that it is the opposite of what they say. Means, therefore, that you and I are going to be enslaved. And many of us, when I look at us, when you look into the faces of people today, you see that they love slavery. They want to be enslaved because if they understood the societies in which we are living, I think that they would have, lots of what our government is doing would not have been possible. Jamaica and other former colonies were used as testing grounds. So we were guinea pigs and still are, right? For the neoliberal reforms that have restructured society in Britain over the past few decades. As we start to look for an alternative way to organize our national and international economies, we could do worse than returning to the unrealized insights of the new international economic order and the young Michael Manley's first term in office. So Michael Manley was such an important person, or remains such an important person in the whole aspect of economic and social development. right? And maybe I should say socio-political and economic development of the world, right? It would be fitting for lots of US citizens to understand, and I've seen many when they come to different, what they call third world countries, they do not seem to look at the social realities and say, what happened here, right? Oh, this country is poor, right? They don't have the highways or they don't have the facilities that we have in the States, right? Only if you would do your homework, only if you would do your research and understand that the countries of Europe during the transatlantic slave trade and after the United States, ascended to on the world stage rather as the superpower, right? The primary empire in the world. Then how is it possible that they are going to develop their resources when when they're governed by this whole ideology of the survival of the fittest, right? And that the dominant countries, right, with dominant economies will control you, right? And when we look at the history of the United States, for example, and we look at the economic activities, Wall Street and these big corporations, you're just sickened to see the level of criminality that you read about, that history en masse. And if you have not yet understood, I think Whitney Webb in her book, One Nation Under Blackmail, right? I think you need to go and read that book to understand that all this wealth and the industries, and you probably don't have to even read that book. If you read slavery, you'd understand. But many of you think that slavery is over and, right? We've now gone into an advanced era and we're much more civilized. Are we? I don't think so, right? Because if you read, you'll understand that we're not as civilized as you think we are. This is a veneer. People dress up in nice ties and, nice suits, right? And they sound intelligent and they go to elite institutions and you have so much, you worship them, right? Not understanding some of the institutions, some of the organizations with which these people are affiliated, right? And you don't care. And you don't care until you find yourselves, like during the pandemic, losing everything, right? It's time for you to wake up. Now, Brian Meeks, right? Brian Meeks wrote a very intelligently written article here. And for those of you who don't know Brian Meeks, he is, or I think he still probably is, a professor of the economics, I believe, at the University of the West Indies, Florida campus, right? I think that Brian Meeks is, in fact, Jamaican. He is also looking and making comparison with the Michael Manley's, both of Michael Manley's persona, his personality, traits during the 1970s and the 1989 when he came back to office. Because we're seeing two different Michael Manleys in terms of his vision of development for Jamaica, right? So you need to understand it's coming from this context. The new Michael Manley, so we are opening again that Michael Manley came back to power in 1989 as a newly converted person, right? So he had now forsaken the sins of being a socialist, right? Of being advocating for democratic socialism, right? He has now abandoned that sort of ideology. And he is now a firm advocate, right, of the free market capitalism, right? Remember, we were given the context that most of the people, his persons with whom his colleagues had already probably perhaps abandoned that system, or some of them had died, right? Some of them would have been killed, like the person in Salvador Allende in Chile, right? Very important for us to understand that. And one of the points I would like to make also before I end this video is that the revolution, right? The Grenadian Revolution in 1923 under the leadership of Maurice Bishop. And we probably need to explore and to delve into that revolution, right? The Grenadian Revolution. Um, the fact of the matter is that I think that the Caribbean lesson, that was a lesson given to by Americans to the Caribbean and Latin America, that if you ever dare to improve the lives of your citizens and to advocate for equality, right? Then this is what is going to happen to you. And it doesn't matter your size, because look at how small Grenada is, right? Could not have been or posed any serious threat to the United States. But the United States had to have sent Grenada that message that you need to understand that we run the show, right? And we are not going to allow any progressive presidents or prime ministers to be in this hemisphere, right? And that was the message that was sent. So I think that Michael Manley, even though he was against the invasion, would also have learned his lesson. By the way, those of you who are saying that Jamaica did participate in the invasion, yes, they did, but it was under Michael Manley. Michael Manley was not in power when the United States invaded Grenada in 1983, right? And deposed and further, the prime minister was killed. Maurice Bishop. Now you must understand that it was under the right-wing, pro-capitalist, pro-United States candidate, Mr. Edward Seaga. And I'm not suggesting here that Mr. Seaga was any demon, but that is now stated fact. It is something that he himself has acknowledged, so it's not something that is conspiratorial or a fringe ideology, okay? The new Manley PNP government, in a manner not dissimilar to ideological shifts, which would later lead to Bill Clinton's and Tony Blair's ascendancy, seemed to subscribe fully to the new paradigm, which is a new paradigm of free market capitalism, which we do practice in Jamaica at this current moment under the esteemed, right, Dr. Nigel Clark, right, who is the brain behind the economic vision for Jamaica, right? What economic vision does Nigel Clark has for Jamaica? None. Perhaps the only vision he has is to enrich himself, right? And the political and economic elites that are there. Now, Manley on many occasions personally defended the efficacy of market relations, and the government embarked on an energetic policy of privatization and import and currency liberalization. So that is the essence of neoliberal economy, all right? This neoliberal ideology, this neocolonial ideology, that you privatize industries. So when you hear people saying, oh, yes, they were happy that Air Jamaica could have been privatized because we were not doing well. Yeah, so much to you when everything is privatized. When your electric company, when your water company, when your airline company, when your whatever, your food companies, everything is privatized. Okay, yes, the government doesn't have to suffer or to bear that sort of expense, right? That expenditure, right? You just put it in the hands of a billionaire, right? And the country will proceed. Now, are you for real? Do you think that these private industries are there to improve on efficiency? You know, I am here in the Dominican Republic, and their electric company is also privatized. And Americans like to come here and they will say, well, the lights are going out all the time. And I have to remind them that the company is in the hands of Americans because it was privatized, right? So they're thinking that it's the Dominicans who do not want to, make efficient this, electrical system, right? And to have the lights be more efficient, not to have these frequent power outages. But I have to remind them that it is in the hands. And I tell you that the government has to subsidize them, even though the people are not getting the service that they should be getting. The government subsidizes them a lot, paying, using taxpayers' money. So at the end of the day, these guys are being woefully rewarded, right? And they make these obscene profits at the country's expense, right? At the country's expense. Now, in the aforementioned debate with Levitt, Manley defended his 1989 policies on the grounds. So even before Michael Manley went back to office, he was already converted. I guess he also saw the wind of change, particularly as the Soviet Union, I'm sure he saw, was coming to an end. And he realized that the United States was now going to occupy the position of the superpower of the world, right? And as I've said to you, he knew what happened to his government in the 1970s. And he knew history very well. He saw what happened in Santo Domingo in the 1960s under the Juan Bosch presidency, right? He'd have seen also what happened to Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. And the list goes on and on and on. And culminated, of course, with the Grenadian invasion, right, in 1933. So Michael Manley would have learned his lessons. Michael Manley was a brilliant mind, right? So he knew that he was not going to be able to test the power of the United States. He knew. So he came back to office as a converted capitalist, right? And you must understand that. Whether or not he was sincere, because remember now, there's people who are Christians and say they're converted, but they're not, right? So we don't know whether Michael Manley was fully converted or he was just saying there to occupy office and to be a political actor on the global stage, right? I don't know. Michael Manley is the only person who could answer that. Now, defended his 1989 policies on the grounds that he had few available options in a new world order. So we're living in a new world order. Sounds conspiratorial, doesn't it? And in adverse situation had sought to maintain key egalitarian components, including a program of worker participation, a push to spread ownership through the distribution of shares to workers. And I stopped there, because Michael Manley became ill, right? And eventually he had to demit office. But I can tell you that in the 1990s, when Michael Manley came back to office, things were not going well for Jamaica, right? Because we then witnessed the rapid devaluation of the Jamaican currency. That when he came to office was about, around about, was it about $6, $7, right? To $1 US. And because Michael Manley opened up our society, liberalized the economy, right? Which means that you're going to privatize your industries, right? And you are going to have less government control. These private entities that come to the country will be able to buy up at cheap cost your primary natural resources, right? And further impoverish your country, right? The slave model, all in a different name, right? This free market capitalism is slavery in a new name, right? Wearing a different, new, fresh clothes of the 21st century, right? And we've got to understand that, right? We've got to eliminate the nonsense that we've learned in most of the books of economics. When we were in school, I when I was in college, found economics to be boring. Yeah, it was a boring subject. I thought that it didn't make any sense. A lot of what they were saying, these theoretical framework and what was happening in the world, I just, I just memorized the information to pass the exam. But I found that much of what they were saying, you know, was mere stupidity and did not align with the realities of the world. And what we find are students who have come out of universities, with even PhDs, who are running economies, managing economies, and they're not doing a good job because they're so, right, bombarded, right, with this sort of nonsensical economic frameworks that they have learned at university level, right? So we've got now to rethink and understand that when we talk about Michael Manley, we cannot just put him in light of what happened in the 70s. I think we often talk about the Michael Manley of the 1970s, and rightly so to an extent because he had 8 years, or was it, yeah, 8 years, or in which to govern from 1972 to 1980. So those were 8 years. Exactly, yeah, 8 years. However, when he came back to power in 1989, that was a short-lived stint, right? So, you see, what could he do in 3 years to transform the Jamaican economy? So we can, and then, rightly so, also the 70s witnessed a lot of social development policies, right? Like we talk about the Bastardly Act, we talk about the free education, free healthcare, right? Lots of other social policies that Michael Mann implemented, right? The maternity leave for women, right? And it goes on and on, right? He did a lot. He accomplished a lot in the social realm during the 1970s. However, because of the destabilization efforts and the fact that many of the local elites emigrated, right? They left Jamaica with their resources, then the country suffered, right? Economically. Country suffered economically. And I think Michael Manley, having reflected, while he was out of office between 1980 to 1988, I think he reflected on what his policies would have caused and the disastrous effect, that's economic effects, that it would have had on the island. One of the things that we have not yet done is to have an open debate on those years and to have some truth and reconciliation, right? We tend to still live in a tribalistic society in which we speak, of people, either they're good or they're bad, right? And why do we look at people and not what they do, at their policies, right? We need to examine more government policies and not to look at the metal of the man or the woman, right? Let's look at what they do, right? Versus who they are, right? Yeah, sometimes we need to know who they are too, but, a lot of times we tend to focus on that. Whether we like you or we don't like you, but, look more at what they do. By their fruits, as the Bible suggests, you shall know them. And by their fruits there is a metaphor for work, right? Whatever they do by their works, their actions. Actions speak louder than words. We must look at our political leaders' actions rather than looking at whether they're black or they're white or they're Asian or they're from, the middle class or the lower strata of society. But so often, that is what we do, right? And our leaders fail us, disappoint us, right? Because we love them so much, right? Now, that was my video. That was my reflection on the second term of Michael Manning's premiership. right? I hope that you have learned something. I hope that you will do further research into who this man was and what might have caused his change, right? From being a social democrat, right, to a uh, avid, to an avid, um, should I say, advocate of this free market ideology. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to seeing you in another video. Have a great week.